So we're for another edition of Things Hidden today, and that is our podcast that we do. We do a deep dive on Rene Girard's mimetic theory and application to various different fields of knowledge and in relation to current events of our time. And we have with us a returning guest, someone who has been on before to talk about the economic connections and insights that can be utilized by using mimetic theory in conjunction with other disciplines like the Austrian School of Economics. So this is a real treat for those of you who like our content we do, for example, every week with Jeff Dice of the Mises Institute. I do that in a more of a economic focus in Austrian school. For fans of that and also fans of mimetic theory, this is going to be a lot of fun. We have with us Burke Peters. Burke Peters has been studying mimetic theory and Austrian school economics and other fields of economics. And he has a new piece on burkepeters.medium.com called Money, Means, and Content, Thoughts on Economics and Desire, which was published just a few days ago as of this show. So welcome back, Burke. How you doing?
I'm good, David. How are you?
Good.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so let's just dive right into it. You start off with a quote: "He that wants money, means, and content is without three good friends." And that's from Corin, As You Like It, Act 3, Scene 2. Is that Shakespeare? That's taboo now. You're not allowed to quote Shakespeare. So you messed up from the beginning. But
I'm going to do it anyway.
Yeah, go ahead. So why did you start with that quote?
So I liked it. I thought it was interesting how he talked about money and he talked about means. And I think he means something like contentment here. I looked at at that part from As You Like It and was thinking about that. And I kind of, I guess, connected that to Mises' description of basically action as seeking a more contented state, and how he talks about means and ends and money. And so it's like, man, that's an Austrian economics quote there from Shakespeare. So I kind of have been digging in for a while, trying to understand economics. And, I guess in a lot of ways, it is a new field. In the grand scheme of things, it's only been around a few hundred years. 1776, Adam Smith, if that's where you want to put the start of things. And he called economics an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. Well, I think that sort of no longer applies. I mean, we start getting into microeconomics, and it's not really about a nation, it's about individuals. And then you have, Alfred Marshall, the financial genius, and he just called that study of man in the ordinary business of life. Well, that also seems a little bit too narrow. We can't talk about nations and big abstract concepts like that with that. But you really just kind of run into these different ways that people are describing it. And I guess it makes sense if we're in a new stage of a science or of a field of or a discipline like this, that there would be some disagreement across the board. And in the beginning of the article, I kind of talk about those different definitions. I do reference the arch rival Keynes and his way of describing things. And
how did he describe it?
It's a long description. Something about modeling semi-permanent or relatively constant factors in economic life, and it's fairly model and statistical dependent, which is interesting stuff. I should be paying attention to that, but there aren't really constant factors, besides these sort of core structures of action. So I do then sort of start talking about action. We kind of talked about that last time, because action in Mises says something along the lines of that it's like the ultimate goal of human action is the satisfaction of our desire. And so that I thought that was really interesting to tie that into triangular desire, and to think about action in the Austrian view, which is sort of like an attempt to substitute a more satisfactory state for a less current satisfactory state, and at the end sought, the more satisfactory state sought, is sort of like what we're aiming at. And economics is the science of the means towards those ends that we're seeking. And so Mises in the Austrian tradition, they generally call that exchange And as the study of that and value is just sort of the importance that we place on those ultimate ends. So Mises and then Austrians sort of delimit economics into the study of means. Ends is the domain of psychology or religion or something. And I would tend to mostly agree with that as far as like the scientific purposes of economics. But I think when we start to think about it practically, and in terms of running businesses, and also just to look at the world of economics as it is, there's behavioral economics, which some people think is nonsense and things like that, but it speaks to our attempt to understand more about the ends that we're going for and things like that within the domain of economics. So I do kind of see that we could sort of fit into this understanding of like a more satisfactory state and a less satisfactory state, and a sort of conceptual understanding of ends sought as something related to triangular desire. That the ends sought, we could sort of take a step further here and say, even the means are sort of a reflection of the ends sought itself. And that, if we look to a certain role model, and that mediator sort of suggests the ends for us. So it allows us to sort of take an extra step further in this analysis.
Can you give a few examples of that come to mind?
Yeah, I mean, it's like, in an economic transaction for a more satisfactory state, for a less satisfactory state, like you'd be more satisfied. There's sort of a core primitive drive, and we kind of talked about this last time, that there's like a sort of core instinctual drive towards to buy to have water. But why you buy a Voss water or something like that is still certainly a part of economics. And I think it's sort of a question of like, why is that particular state more satisfactory than just drinking from a very generic brand of water? Otherwise, they wouldn't take that action. So it allows us to understand why someone might make those differences. Another part that I don't reference in the article is that there's like these feedbacks that more people desire something, maybe the more desirable it becomes. If you raise the price of jewelry, people can sort of connect that as being more valuable. You sold a bunch of jewelry for a lower price, and you raise the price of jewelry. Well, suddenly all these people have much more prestigious pieces of jewelry that just got them for a better deal in the past. And maybe some of their friends spot that and are like, wow, I didn't know that he could afford that kind of jewelry. Maybe I should go get something, so it's sort of allows you to get a bit of an insight into that. I'm a little bit rushing here, but I guess in my article, one aspect that I felt wasn't clear enough I'd like to sort of bring up is how Girard started with this understanding of mimetic theory through a lens of literary analysis, and critical sort of analysis of stories and narratives. So I also thought that was interesting in the concept of economics, because Robert Schiller, Yale University's, wrote a book called Narrative Economics, and has done quite a bit of research on the effects of our narratives and played out in financial media and things like that have on stock prices or various sort of economic variables. And I really think that's interesting, because I think narrative can be understood in a structural manner somewhat. And I talk about that in the article from Algirdas Grimus and Vladimir Prop in the potential model. Those are somewhat complicated theories of the structure of like fairy tales or just basic stories. But it's interesting because the names of some of the sort of characters or archetypes within a story are straight up Girardian. There's an object, and there's a subject, and they call it a sender, but it's somewhat of a mediator. And in a good story, Gandalf, the sender, sort of spurs, and as well as Bilbo, sort of spurs this desire in the subject, Frodo, to sort of take and seek an objective, mainly to take the ring to Mordor, and the receiver, so that all the people of Middle-earth are now free. And there's various helpers, the elves, and there's various opponents, the goblins. And the interesting part of that is that there's no reference to who gave Gandalf the desire. Gandalf gives Bilbo the desire, that Bilbo and Gandalf give the desire to Frodo to be the straight hero and adventurer who leaves the Shire. But it's not necessarily ever told how Gandalf got that idea. So that's sort of a mystical component to it, where it sort of speaks to, I think, just the level of what we're, it could be some sort of transcendental mediation going on with Gandalf, or something like that. But it allows you to sort of pick up on those sort of themes in the story and structure it. And there is probably at some point going to be something along the lines of a narrative analysis of economics, where in like real time we can sort of understand a little bit better at an analytical level, for this story, who's the subject, who is the sender, what are they trying to achieve with this, and then sort of what mimetic ecology are they a part of that. It gets a little bit odd, but when you're dealing with finance, some of this is just here to practically help us understand how the markets are behaving and things like that.
So do you see the narrative thing as symbolic representations of these complex systems of human behavior and finance, or are they actually, in some sense, operative for driving the economic actors making the choices they're making? Meaning, like, are they on a literal quest, or are we just using these as allegories to try to make sense of the complex structures of human action in this financial systems and business?
Well, it's hard to say. I think that we sort of live inside these broader narrative structures, and maybe we have a Christian worldview, and we have this view of the world where there's specific understanding of who we are as an identity, and there's an understanding of where we are in geography as well as in history, and sort of what is wrong with our surroundings now, and what are we sort of aiming for. And so if you were to really ask those questions at a deep level for different cultures throughout society, they would give you different answers, but there would be somewhat of a common theme at the deepest level for the culture. And so sort of like, and N.T. Wright talks about this for what was Jesus' worldview, sort of who was Jesus, where, why did he choose this point in time, what kind of problem was there to solve, and things like that. So it's a pretty difficult question to answer at that high of a level, but I think it's sort of there underlying a lot of our behavior, sort of the assumptions we make about who we are, where we are, what's wrong, where we're going, and that sort of speaks to sort of like a desire complex, that sort of a part of that narrative are these role models and mediators for that sort of challenge or heroes sort of arc story. So it's like a very grand narrative sort of view of things, but I do think that these things play out at a fairly abstract level. And, to take it down to a more practical, financial, I guess, economic level, the way I try to sort of give an example is that there's literally a worldview for quant traders that's different from the worldview of Warren Buffett style fundamental analysis guys. That their understanding of who they are and where they are, and it's not so much as different there probably, but the real understanding of like what's the problem that their strategy is trying to solve is different. And I think there's definitely a lot of like just imitation across different businesses operating basically on the same strategies. And traders sort of have a term for this. I have to think about it for a second, but it's something like this is a crowded trade. A lot of people are doing the same trade. So it's not necessarily a good trade because maybe there's not an opportunity there, but there's sort of a reason why the trade is crowded. And it says something about, I think, sort of a worldview of related to finance of like sort of how do I interact with the financial system? And who am I in this financial system? There's like retail traders sort of have their own psychology compared to institutional traders. And that's part of that is legal delimitations on like what they're allowed to do. So retail trader would be fairly limited. You have to have a larger account in order to be able to trade certain assets and securities. Whereas institutional investors may be prohibited from trading in certain securities. And so that, that's more of a codified system. But I think this is happening definitely at a more abstract level. I'm not sure if I answered your question completely. I do think there's some feedback because, we're sort of born into a world where there's large amount of existing stories. But we're really born at a specific time in a specific place. And so as we grow up, we're sort of only given access to the stories that we have access to. And most of those come from our parents, and those sort of slowly spread out to the rest of our community and society as we get access to the internet and things like this. But there's sort of a feedback there. The individual still is making actions and still that's the core unit of economic analysis and all this. But we create these stories, we inhabit these stories, and they affect us, and we possibly affect them. I don't know how much certain individuals in history seem to have affected the play out of these stories to greater degree than others. But there's a lot of stories going on at different levels all at the same time.
Yeah, that reminds me of that video clip that recently circulated about that. Who was that investor that was hanging out with Warren Buffett, the old guy, and he was saying, "I like the Chinese system.
Charlie Munger.
Who is that?
Charlie Munger. He would be.
Is he your hero?
No, I'm not. Not a huge fan of either one of them. To be honest with you, they were both just managing. I'm not sure what he specifically does at Berkshire Hathaway, but he would be Warren Buffett's partner for Berkshire.
He was saying he liked the way China shut Jack Ma up because he was talking about wanting to do things differently from the party, and he said, "I wish we could have something like that, minus some of the bad stuff." But
yeah,
the devil's in the details about minus some of the bad stuff. If he already wants, people to be taken out of the equation by the government, but that gives you a window into the mindset of the people who are parasitically rigging the economy for their benefit. In my opinion, that's their mindset. They want more power over the market. They want this quasi state, quasi capital, private, mixture.
Yeah.
Talk about that a little bit. Talk about the stories behind that for a moment. I know I like to get you into the real world events, but it's people apply these insights you've got.
So for Warren Buffett, the stories that Warren Buffett tells, that's what I'll say. There's a few of them. I mean, one of the more egregious is that Warren Buffett made a lot of money buying smaller cap stocks and biomed stocks and things like that when he was younger. So he made a lot of money doing that. And then once he was running an account with several $1 billion in it, he sort of shifted to his current strategy, and it's sort of specialized since then to the larger and larger thing. Meanwhile, he goes around and sort of spreads this folksy story that you can read Ben Graham's Intelligent Investor and be just as successful as he is. So it's sort of a story to, I think, make people feel good about him and to make him feel more approachable. Like, if I just disciplined followed this, if I am not as successful as Warren Buffett, it's because I didn't really follow this, which that's not really true. Warren Buffett knows a significant amount about finance, and he's studied, 10K reports for 40 years in specific companies since it was just railroads, So it's like, there's a little bit of a story going on there that I think leads a lot of people to just get into that and to sort of adapt his worldview of, there's all these crypto rat poison sort of things, and you shouldn't pay attention to those. You should sort of do what I do, or if you can't do what I do, you should just buy an index fund. So there's a whole lot of problems with that story, but that's a story, and he's spreading it, and there's a lot of people who believe that story. And then, to pull it into the mimetic level, it's like I sort of spoke about this last time, but Jean-Michel Gourlion, I think I got that right, writes about the three brains. And
writes about it in what?
The three brains in his mimetic brain. And I think that's a really interesting lens to just think about a little factoid or a news source from, or like a news story from. So you get a little factoid from Warren Buffett. And it's interesting how often there's not a lot of rational content in there, that most of the time it's sort of relying on an assumed authority that Warren Buffett has. And then he's sort of making an emotional argument about something. Not all the time, but it definitely does happen. So in the Bitcoin case, especially early on, back in 2017, at least, I know for one specific instance where he basically just said Bitcoin is rat poison into the conversation. It's like, well, that's an example. I mean, he's really putting a story into the situation. He's really injecting himself into the story in a negative possible way. So I think there's ways that people sort of look at the grand narrative of things in finance, or the narrative that's sort of playing out. And they sort of, I don't know that people are really active as someone who sort of like start these narratives and get them generated. Now that might be the case. Some conspiracy theory there of someone sort of generating this narrative. And you could talk about some certain finance people there pretty easily. But I think people do sort of position themselves as helpers and opponents to a story. So there might be there's a lot of news stories about Bitcoin millionaires, and they're sort of the subject of the story, and the object is to become a millionaire, right? Who sent them on that quest, and who's the receiver? Well, it's not really told, but you can quickly pick up on who's the helpers and who's the opponents of these types of stories, and you can see that Warren Buffett's an opponent of Bitcoin. Something about Bitcoin hurts Warren Buffett in a way that he can't rationally just go out and say on television. So he needs to say something a little bit more emotionally loaded. So it does, I think, help us understand why people are taking other investors are taking the actions that they're taking. And in finance, a lot of it, whether or not people want to believe this, it does matter what other people are doing in finance. But if you're going to invest in something, you really do care that other people think that that's going to be more valuable next year. It can't just be you that thinks it's more valuable next year.
Yeah, when you look at the worldview narratives and how they shape, I think that's very important that we can learn that from the mimetic theory work. This idea of having a linear view of history, of Christianity, making this thought that we're going to go somewhere, we're building something towards something, has a huge impact on the economic values and aspirations and goals that a community will have. And so if you try to choke out, and they haven't done it, but they try to choke out any acceptance of Christianity as a dominant framework of a culture, you're going to choke out any opportunity of having a forward win-win solution for anything. It's going to devolve into a zero-sum game. And that's why you see cultures that are not as infected with Christianity having a hard time getting basic infrastructure and private contract stuff like trust. I was just seeing this the other day. A person in India was talking about how there's a low trust issue there. They don't have a lot of trust. In Christianity is where that's where faith is. Faith is trust. So if you have a high trust society, you can have a co-op where people go in and they get their milk and they swap out, they put their money in and they, get their raw milk or whatever. And it's a trust-based society. He doesn't have to have a security guard to make sure that the milk isn't being stolen and the cash pile isn't being robbed in the box. But if you do that in low trust societies, he was saying, he was from India, and he was saying if you did that in certain places in India, they just steal all of the milk and all of the cash that was left in the box. So how do you create a high trust society? I think it requires you to have a proper story that allows trust to flourish, right? Is that a good way to look at it, maybe? Because I don't think Charlie Munger, whoever that is, has a high trust society. Well, he may have a high trust in some things, but it seems like he's content to have a low trust society. That's the kind of society he wants, which is something that's not going to allow for the flourishing and the disruption of capital in a way that allows for upward mobility for people on the lower end of the hierarchy. Because China is this idea of China has a low trust society, and that's why they have to take out Jack Ma when he speaks out against their system. And I'm not taking a side either way on whatever Jack Ma was saying. The point is you have to rely on a lot of coercion if you have a low trust society. And I think that needs to be talked about more.
Certainly something there, I guess in hearing you say this, in my head, I'm thinking about how the narrative, the sort of the controlling narrative of media and politics today is becoming sort of choked. As we've seen that in the run up to the election, just how get all these people banned. I have buddies that had their Twitter accounts banned for suggesting a lab leak hypothesis, and now that's perfectly acceptable. So and that might not seem like a big deal, but there was a significant amount of clamping down on the acceptable narrative. And even now you get Facebook giving you, suggesting you to rat on your friends as potential extremists. So this is sort of an interesting, aspect of this is that when you try to clamp down on that narrative, the narratives that you're sort of cutting away, I don't think all of those just go away. I think a lot of those get driven underground in the resentment by the people who believe in who are sort of pushing for those narratives, sort of grows.
You talked a little about semiotics, which is an interesting field of philosophy that I don't think a lot of people know too much about, and it's a little bit out of my wheel of study and so forth. So tell us a little bit about this. I guess it kind of connects to some of the narrative economics you were describing, right?
Yeah, I mean, a great symbol would be the bull in Wall Street, and the bears and the bulls, things like that. And there's a lot of symbols in finance. So just to pull it all together here a little bit, I think that we have some definitions of economics, and they're a little scattered. And I think we have some understanding through Austrian economics of desire playing a part in action and in economics, and triangular desire that sort of leads naturally. And that triangular desire and mimetic theory sort of began as a study of narrative, and it sort of spread to a more fundamental human understanding. And that there is a new field of narrative economics with Robert Shiller at Yale University, and that there's just a lot more there than even Shiller talks about some of these semiotic signs. But when we talk about worldview, we are talking about these stories and these signs and these practices that lead into these sort of different traditions of doing things. And I think there are traditions in economics, and there are traditions in business and in economic life that could be studied and understood. And there are a lot of signs and a lot of practices that can help us understand a lot more.
So what is going on where people feel like the story for millennials is the baby boomers and all that have all the wealth, and the millennials feel like they never got a chance to have access to the housing market in the entry point they could afford. They have debt that their boomer parents didn't have. They have a stagnant economy. It's way more stratified than it was when their parents were there. And so obviously there's a mimetic rivalry between generations that's at play in that story. But what, on the fundamental economic standpoint, can we look at here with mimetic theory and the Austrian school as to why that's playing out? Why is it that these BlackRock company is owning so many of the houses in the neighborhood? Why can't you buy a home? What is this? What's happening? What's wrong with the economic system we're in? What's going on? What's your story for it?
So hey, that's a great question. There's a couple different ways you could probably look at this, but it's clear that we're talking about who are we talking about? We're talking about millennials. Where are they? They're in the United States. And what is wrong? Well, they can't buy houses, and there's a whole bunch of problems with inflation and all these different things going on that, it feels like they're losing the ability to search for to reach for the American dream that their parents had. So that's clearly the problem for a lot of people, and they talk about it constantly. And then I think there's a variety of subcultures that have different answers to that solution. So there's a lot of people who seem to think that this is just a late stage capitalism problem, and we probably should just riot in the streets. There's also people who think we need to return to some sort of primitivist homesteading style of living. Then there's, I think, the technologists, people who want to build technology to help us solve these problems. I think there's a variety of problems. I think there's a lot of shared there is still in America a lot of shared understanding of who we are and where we are. I think that's somewhat fracturing, but I think we do all seem to understand the problems. There's some people seem to think that this transgender men and female sports is a huge problem. Some people don't think it is. So maybe we need to go back a level analysis and ask what's different about who those people think they are, and where they are in history and what the problem is clearly different. So, and there's a lot that could definitely be pulled apart there. Now, the solution to that problem, I'm not completely sure. I think people need to be able to build new houses. I think in California, it's basically, we have this problem of skyrocketing home prices, and they're not allowed to build new houses. So yeah, BlackRock buys all the houses in California. Well, that's a great investment because every person born in California increases the demand for housing. And if you can't build new houses, that's the way it is. And then they're also trying to sort of keep people from immigrating into certain states, or keep people from certain states from immigrating in. There's a lot of weirdness going on there. So I'm not, I own a house, and I'm 27 years old. I'm probably in the minority. It is possible in certain places. There's certainly a problem with, I think the problem probably goes deeper, and education would be a really obvious one. Just, you hear a lot of older boomer stories of, I paid for college in the summer, working in the summer. It's like, well, I worked in the summer too, and I still owe a lot of money. So, it's not as much as, hopefully I managed it fairly well, but there's a significant difference. I'm not saying I have all the answers, but I do certainly think that it helps us to understand why people are reacting in the ways they are.
So is the decline in generations a product of the story changing, or is it just some kind of economic?
Well, there's not.
What comes first, the story or the economics? It's like a chicken or egg, right?
It seems like it somewhat. I mean, to a degree, the scarcity is real, and you can't invent a story that just says everybody gets, free gold, or something like that, because there's not enough gold to give everybody everything. So scarcity is, I think, a reality, and it's not just a story that we're making up. So there's an element of the real world that folks set up, no matter what story we come up with. But the story does affect a huge amount of things that are a little less real. There's a lot to our economy that I think is not real. It's basically just a story.
And why is it not real? Because of the Federal Reserve System? What you're talking about?
That's one angle. Yeah, we could go into, but then it's like, like we talked about the bottled water. There's a lot of stories about why you need to buy Voss water or Fiji. And they seem sort of innocent and small, but it just opens up a little bit of a opening there to see what I'm talking about. That the real world is, you need water. The story is, you got to have Voss water, Fiji water, and it's involved in that story are mimetic mediators that sort of entice you even more. And that's really where it comes from in terms of the desire to pursue that line of thinking. But our framing of the situation places ourselves as a subject within the story.
Right. So when we look at this mimetic approach to economics, what are some kind of insights that we can propose that need further research for the future? People that are questions or themes that you think need further research and investigation.
I take it from a practical point of view. I don't know how much data there is available for this. I know Robert Schiller has done quite a bit of studies on narrative economics.
Is he familiar with René Girard's work?
I wouldn't be certain. No, wouldn't surprise me, but because he's done some work on studying structure of stories, so it would make sense. But I think that would be an opening, particularly for just trying to sort of break down the language and the linguistics of our financial news stories into massive databases. This is a pretty complex project, but you could potentially try to understand something of the structure of those narratives through our natural language programming or processing, and just try to understand if there's any way we can sort of piece apart these broader narratives and the sort of the mediators involved in those, and something of the mechanism for which people sort of switch from one narrative to another. There's a lot, I think, that could be understood. It's not, I think there is a predictive element where, if we understand something of what a large group of people agree is the problem, and understand the different solutions that they're proposing to that problem, as well as we can sort of do an analysis of whether that's a legitimate response to that problem, and make our sort of prediction as to whether or not that response will play out. And so it's sort of set it up as a situation where it's sort of like, if they continue to do this, this will happen. If they do this, this will happen, sort of thing. Helps us understand that at a deeper level than just understanding the action as a seeking of a more contented state and sort of leaving it at that.
Yeah, and I think there needs to be more research into the apocalyptic element of what Rene Girard was looking at in history, which is that we're in this unraveling of hierarchical structures and structures of meaning and structures of differentiation. And as those structures of differentiation, gender, borders, all these different things are disintegrating because people are pointing out the opportunities for oppression that existed in some of the ways those differences were maintained in the past. And because of this zeal to flatten all differentiation, we are entering into a very, very unprecedented time in world history that I think needs to have proper economic connection to it. And I don't know exactly how to map that out, but to me, it creates an urgency, kind of almost, not that I'm not talking about like prepper type economics. Who knows what that might be, but because, every empire can collapse. So I'm not just talking about America as a falling apart, but just culturally, how we've lost any grounding in differences. And if we don't have differences, you're going to have madness and hyper-mimetic hysteria. And I think that's what we're seeing today. I think almost half the country, or I guess 1/3 of the country, has totally checked out of, I don't know. It just seems like they've checked out of reality in the sense of it's like they've abandoned any consistency with even recent history. The left used to be so critical of big corporations, and now big corporations tell them anything, and it's like, what happened to you? And it's like they've had trauma or something. Trauma has just wiped out their recent memory. And I guess it was the Trump that was the trauma for them. And then the pandemic and all this stuff. I don't know. I think Trump was such an outlier for their sense of reality, their Mr. Rogers reality. They thought the only way to have a leader is that a leader can bomb the hell out of every little life they can find on the globe. But if they talk like Mr. Rogers, that's the sign of moral decency. It's this Gnostic madness. It's Gnostic because there's no appreciation for flesh and blood reality. It's just lost their minds in this Gnostic mania. And I don't know how long this mania is going to last. And look, the right's got a lot of problems too. We're not trying to pick one team here. It's just that the left is the dominant hegemonic culture of our time. They make the movies, they make the music, they make the performance art, they make the university curricula, they make the protests, they make the Coca-Cola, they make the Pepsi, they make the whole thing. And they've lost their ever-loving mind. And I don't know what economics looks like when because we have such a borderless society because of the internet, when that mania is sweeping wildly around the world, how in the world are we going to have economic planning? How are we going to have capital structure? Math is under attack. Math is under attack. Ladies and gentlemen, math is under attack. We have never had entrepreneurs have a world in a long time, at least, where math was under attack. It's been a while.
I think at almost at an aesthetic level or something that Trump was, like you said, Trump derangement syndrome. It just drove them crazy a little bit, and that
they're
Biden
still there
was
though.
Annex.
They didn't recover.
comes in and he's eating his ice cream cones, and you got to have a picture of Biden eating his ice cream cone to make you feel happy inside. And that's where we're at.
But we don't know. How do you make economic planning in this environment? I don't know. Because math is a problem. Engineering is a problem. The building fell apart in South Florida. Engineers in the pipelines, remember, they didn't even know how to fix the pipelines. Remember that whole hack thing? They said they didn't know what to do because all the engineers are retired. What the hell? We're in a state of, this is apocalyptic economics. Like, the generation has not been trained to be able to keep the pipeline structures building. If we don't have pipelines or plumbing, if we don't have math, you know what I mean?
Right.
One apple equals 2 apples. No, that's called white supremacy. If it's what? Once we've got to that point, that's a mania. That is a disintegration of an empire. But because this is a global empire, because of our interconnectedness with the globe, that's going to create a situation where the whole world's going to lose its mind together. So how do we make economic calculation in a mania? That's what we need to think about.
Well, we can't in a centrally planned system. So if they're going crazy, it's going to cause some craziness. If we're losing contact with reality, eventually there's going to be a reckoning. And unless there's more intervention, which is just pushing it down the road more, which is probably what we're going to see for a while here. But I do think that the story is cracking a little bit, that there's a lot more subversive elements in the narrative than there was 10 years ago. There's just a lot of subcultures on the internet that are generating their own worldviews that are deeply in opposition of the controlling narrative. And they're becoming more bold. I don't remember quite the name, but there are a few militia groups who've just been, there was one militia group that had 11 members arrested or something, left-wing militia groups or apolitical militia groups. Forget what they call themselves. We just keep having a lot of these subversive narratives pop up within these subcultures that are just not in line with the controlling narrative. And I'm not saying that that's a good or a bad thing. I think that there are certainly some bad elements to it, and there's probably some good elements to it too. But we have a much bigger problem than anyone is able to articulate. It's certainly not the controlling narrative. The media and the political class is not able to explain to us the situation properly. They've sort of lost the control of the narrative, but they're still sort of running zombie-like, I think.
Yeah. And the more they lose control, the more aggressive they try to control the narrative. Well, yeah, I wanted to thank you for joining me, and we'll continue this discussion in the future, okay?
Yeah, it's great talking to you.
All right, thanks. And check out your website is burkepeters.medium.com. That's Burke with the E. burkepeters.medium.com. Check out this article.
All right.
All right, thanks.